Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where centuries of royal tradition meet modern scandal, two brothers stood on opposite sides of an unforgivable divide. One wore the weight of a future crown, the other carried the shame of choices that would echo through history. What happened on that cold December morning in 2023 would change the British royal family forever. This is not just another royal story of privilege and protocol. This is the true account of how Prince William, heir to the throne, made the most difficult decision of his life: to personally confront his uncle Andrew and ensure justice was served, even if it meant tearing apart the very fabric of royal unity. The black van waited outside the palace gates like a hearse for a dying dynasty. Inside, Andrew would begin a journey that would strip away his titles, his dignity, and his place in the only family he had ever known. But this story begins long before that van arrived. In the shadowy corridors where royal secrets are kept and family loyalty is tested beyond breaking point. What you're about to read is the untold story of palace drama at its most raw and real, where love, duty, and justice collide in ways that would make Shakespeare weep. This is the story of how a future king chose his conscience over his bloodline, and how the House of Windsor learned that some stains can never be washed clean, no matter how blue the blood that carries them. The morning fog clung to the windows of Kensington Palace like secrets refusing to be revealed. Prince William stood in his private study, holding a file that had arrived at dawn through channels so secure that even his own security team hadn't been informed. The contents were explosive enough to bring down governments, let alone destroy what remained of his uncle's reputation. Catherine entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea, her movements careful and deliberate. She had seen that look on her husband's face before, the same expression he wore when duty demanded something that would cost him personally. The weight of future kingship had been pressing down on William for months, but this morning felt different. This morning, the burden seemed to have doubled overnight. "The children are asking why you missed breakfast again," Catherine said softly, setting his cup on the mahogany desk that had once belonged to his grandmother. The Queen's presence still lingered in every corner of the palace, her voice echoing in William's memory whenever he faced impossible decisions. What would she have done? What would she have wanted him to do? William didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the documents spread before him. Photographs, financial records, witness statements, all painting a picture so damaging that it made Andrew's previous scandals look like minor indiscretions. The Jeffrey Epstein affair had been devastating, but this was different. This was fresh evidence, new victims, and proof that Andrew had learned nothing from his spectacular fall from grace. "He's done it again," William finally whispered, his voice barely audible even in the silent room. "After everything that happened, after all the promises, after the family stood by him, he's done it again." Catherine moved closer, her hand finding his shoulder. She didn't need to see the documents to understand the weight of what her husband was carrying. The past 3 years had been a masterclass in crisis management for the royal family. First, there had been Harry and Meghan's exodus, followed by the Queen's death. Then Charles's cancer diagnosis, and now this, another scandal that threatened to overshadow everything positive the monarchy had tried to rebuild. The secure phone on William's desk buzzed with an encrypted message. It was from Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, requesting an immediate meeting at Clarence House. Charles had obviously received his own copy of the file. William could only imagine how his father was processing this latest betrayal. The King's relationship with Andrew had always been complicated. Protective one moment, exasperated the next, but always fundamentally loyal. That loyalty was about to be tested in ways that would redefine the very concept of family. William rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and heavy. He was 41 years old, but in moments like these he felt ancient. The responsibility of his position wasn't just about ceremony and state visits anymore. It was about being the moral compass for an institution that millions of people looked to for stability and honor. And right now, that compass was pointing toward one of the most difficult decisions any future king had ever been forced to make. "I have to see Father," he said, straightening his tie with hands that trembled slightly. "And then, I have to see Andrew." The drive to Clarence House took only minutes, but William used every second to prepare for what would likely be the most difficult conversation he'd ever had with his father. The King's cancer treatment had been successful, but the ordeal had changed Charles in subtle ways. He seemed more fragile, more aware of his mortality, and paradoxically more protective of his remaining family members. Breaking this news to him felt like delivering another terminal diagnosis. Charles was waiting in his private sitting room, the same documents scattered across his coffee table. His face had aged visibly in the hours since receiving the file. The King of England, who had spent his entire life preparing for the crown, looked like a man who was discovering just how heavy that crown could be. "William," Charles said without looking up, "tell me there's some mistake. Tell me these documents are fabricated, that someone is trying to frame Andrew for reasons we don't understand yet." But William had spent hours verifying the information. He had called in favors from intelligence contacts, cross-referenced every detail, and even had his own security team conduct a preliminary investigation. The evidence was solid, the sources credible, and the implications devastating. Andrew hadn't just failed to learn from his past mistakes. He had actively ignored every warning, every boundary, every attempt by the family to keep him out of trouble. "Father, we both know Andrew," William said carefully, settling into the chair across from the king. "We know his judgment, his inability to see consequences, his talent for surrounding himself with exactly the wrong people. This isn't a surprise, it's an inevitability we've been dreading for 3 years." Charles finally looked up, and William was shocked by what he saw in his father's eyes. It wasn't anger or disappointment, it was fear. The king was terrified of what this would do to the monarchy, to the family, to his own legacy, that had barely begun to be written. The crown that had taken him 74 years to inherit was now at risk of being tarnished beyond repair by a brother who couldn't seem to learn from his own spectacular failures. "What do we do?" Charles asked. And for the first time in William's life, his father sounded lost, uncertain, almost childlike in his confusion. "How do we handle this without destroying everything we've worked to rebuild? How do we protect the institution while still being a family?" William had been asking himself the same questions throughout the sleepless night. The answer wasn't in any royal protocol handbook or constitutional law textbook. This required something unprecedented. A member of the royal family to be held accountable not just by public opinion or media scrutiny, but by his own family. It required someone to step up and deliver consequences that Andrew had somehow managed to avoid his entire adult life. "We do what should have been done 3 years ago," William said, his voice gaining strength as his resolve crystallized. "We remove him, completely. Not just from public duties or royal patronages, from the family itself. We make it clear that being born into this family doesn't give you a lifetime pass to hurt people and embarrass the crown." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles stared at his son as if seeing a stranger, someone capable of making decisions that even the king found too harsh to contemplate. But William wasn't finished. The plan that had been forming in his mind throughout the morning was more comprehensive than simple exile. "I want to handle this personally," William continued. "Not through lawyers or courtiers or official statements. I want to confront Andrew face to face, give him one chance to explain himself, and then personally ensure that he leaves royal properties and royal protection behind. Forever." Charles recoiled as if William had suggested something treasonous. The idea of one royal family member forcibly removing another went against centuries of tradition, against the very concept of royal immunity and family loyalty that had protected monarchs through scandals, wars, and revolutions. But William wasn't thinking like a traditional royal anymore. He was thinking like a future king who understood that survival required evolution, even if that evolution was painful. "You can't be serious," Charles whispered. "He's your uncle. He's my brother. Whatever he's done, whatever mistakes he's made, he's still family. We don't exile family members like medieval kings casting out traitors." But William had made his decision, and nothing his father could say would change his mind. The evidence in that file wasn't just about Andrew's poor judgment or inappropriate associations. It was about real harm to real people, about an institution that was supposed to represent the best of British values being dragged through the mud by someone who simply refused to accept responsibility for his actions. "We do now," William said firmly. "Because the alternative is watching him destroy everything you've inherited and everything I'll inherit. The alternative is explaining to George, Charlotte, and Louis why their great-uncle was allowed to keep hurting people just because he happened to be born into the right family." The mention of his grandchildren hit Charles like a physical blow. The king had always been devoted to William's children, seeing in them the future of the monarchy and the hope for its continued relevance. The idea that their inheritance might be poisoned by Andrew's scandals was more than Charles could bear. "How?" Charles asked finally, his voice resigned. "How do you propose to handle something like this without creating an even bigger scandal? The media will have a field day. The Republicans will use this as proof that the monarchy is corrupt beyond saving. Parliament might start asking questions about why we allowed this to go on for so long." William had anticipated these concerns, and his answer revealed just how much thought he had put into this unprecedented action. He wasn't acting on impulse or anger. This was a calculated decision made by someone who understood both the immediate necessity and the long-term implications. "We do it quietly, quickly, and with enough documentation to prove that we took appropriate action when we learned the full extent of his behavior, William explained. We don't announce it, we simply make it clear through his absence that Andrew is no longer part of the working royal family. When questions are asked, we refer to the evidence and make it clear that this was a family decision based on behavior that was incompatible with royal duties. The plan was bold, risky, and completely unprecedented. But as Charles looked at his son, really looked at him, he began to see something that both impressed and frightened him. William wasn't just the future king anymore. He was already thinking and acting like a monarch, making decisions that prioritized the institution over personal relationships, the crown over family loyalty. When? Charles asked, and William knew he had won his father's reluctant support. Today, William replied. Andrew is at Royal Lodge. He thinks he's untouchable there, surrounded by his own security and insulated from consequences. It's time he learned that nobody is untouchable when they've crossed the line he's crossed. As William prepared to leave Clarence House, Charles caught his arm with surprising strength. The king's eyes were filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow that William would remember for the rest of his life. Be careful, son, Charles whispered. What you're about to do will change you. It will change all of us. Make sure you're prepared for what comes next, because there won't be any going back from this. William nodded, understanding the weight of his father's words, but knowing there was no alternative. As he walked out into the London morning, he felt the full burden of his future crown settling on his shoulders. Today he would stop being just a prince and start being a king in everything but name. Today he would learn what it truly meant to choose duty over family, justice over loyalty, and the future over the past. The drive to Royal Lodge would take 45 minutes. 45 minutes to prepare for a confrontation that would echo through royal history books for generations to come. Royal Lodge sat nestled in the heart of Windsor Great Park, like a fortress of faded grandeur. Its pink walls and ornate gardens are testament to an era when royal scandal could be contained within carefully manicured boundaries. As William's convoy approached the circular driveway, he noticed the subtle signs of a man living in denial: fresh paint on the exterior walls, perfectly maintained grounds, and an air of normalcy that felt almost desperate in its perfection. Andrew's security team recognized the future king's vehicles immediately, but there was confusion in their movements. No visit had been scheduled, no official notification had been received through proper channels. William watched through tinted windows as guards spoke hurriedly into their radios, trying to understand why the heir to the throne had arrived unannounced on what should have been a quiet Tuesday morning. William stepped out of his vehicle alone, having instructed his own protection officers to maintain a respectful distance. This confrontation needed to be as private as possible, at least initially. The fewer witnesses to what was about to unfold, the better for everyone involved. He straightened his navy wool coat and walked toward the entrance with measured steps, each footfall carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape the royal family forever. The massive oak door opened before William could ring the bell. Andrew stood in the doorway, dressed in his familiar uniform of pressed khakis and a cashmere sweater, his hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. To an outside observer, he looked like any other wealthy gentleman enjoying retirement in his country home, but William could see the tension in his uncle's shoulders, the uncertainty in his eyes, the subtle signs of a man who knew his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "William," Andrew said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What a pleasant surprise. I wasn't expecting you today. Come in, come in. I'll have Mrs. Peanut. Henderson, prepare some tea." The formal politeness felt surreal given the circumstances. Here was a man who had to know why his nephew was standing on his doorstep, yet he was maintaining the pretense that this was a social call. William followed Andrew into the sitting room, noting how nothing had changed since his last visit years earlier. The same antique furniture, the same family photographs carefully arranged to show Andrew's connections to more respectable members of the royal family. The same atmosphere of entitlement that had always surrounded his uncle like expensive cologne. "We need to talk, Andrew," William said, declining the offered seat and remaining standing in the center of the room. "Privately, send your staff away." Something in William's tone must have finally penetrated Andrew's denial because his forced smile faltered. He moved to the intercom system and quietly dismissed the household staff, instructing them to take their break early and not to disturb him for the next hour. The silence that followed their departure was oppressive, filled with unspoken accusations and the weight of 3 years' worth of accumulated tension. William reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, placing it carefully on the coffee table between them. The simple action felt monumental, like setting off an explosive device with a delayed fuse. Andrew stared at the envelope as if it contained a death sentence, which in many ways it did. "Open it," William said quietly. Andrew's hand shook slightly as he broke the seal and spread the contents across the polished surface. Photographs, financial records, sworn statements, hotel receipts, phone records. A comprehensive documentation of behavior that made his previous scandals look like minor indiscretions. William watched his uncle's face cycle through denial, anger, fear, and finally, a kind of hollow acceptance that was almost pitiful to witness. "Where did you get these?" Andrew whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's not the question you should be asking," William replied. "The question is how you thought you could continue this behavior after everything that happened 3 years ago. How you thought you could keep putting this family, this institution, and innocent people at risk for your own selfish gratification." Andrew looked up from the documents, and for a moment, William saw a flash of the man his uncle might have been under different circumstances. Not the entitled prince who had never faced real consequences, but a broken, frightened individual who finally understood that his protection was gone, his immunity revoked, his safety net removed. "It's not what it looks like," Andrew said, but even he seemed to know how hollow the words sounded. "These situations were complicated. The circumstances weren't. I mean, the context is important, and these documents don't show—" "Stop," William interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that surprised them both. "Don't insult my intelligence with denials and excuses. I've spent the last 18 hours having every single piece of evidence verified by people who know how to do this professionally. I know what you did, when you did it, and how you tried to cover it up afterward." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Andrew sank into his leather armchair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. The confident, defiant man who had faced down Parliament and the press was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that his reckoning had arrived. "What do you want from me?" Andrew asked finally. "I want you to understand that your time as a member of this family is over," William said, his words measured and deliberate. "Not just your public duties or your patronages, your place at family gatherings, your access to royal properties, your security protection, your financial support, everything. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed, and there are no more second chances." Andrew's head snapped up, color returning to his cheeks as anger replaced fear. "You can't do that. You're not the king. Charles is my brother, and he would never agree to something so drastic. This family doesn't abandon its own, no matter what mistakes might have been made. Father has already given his consent." William lied smoothly, knowing that his father's reluctant agreement would become full support once he understood the alternative was watching the monarchy crumble under the weight of Andrew's scandals. "And I'm not asking for your agreement or your cooperation. I'm informing you of a decision that has already been made." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching outside. William moved to the window and saw what he had been expecting. A black van with tinted windows, followed by 2 unmarked cars. His arrangements were proceeding exactly as planned. Andrew joined him at the window, his face paling as he realized what he was seeing. "What is this?" Andrew demanded, his voice rising with panic. "What have you done?" "I've ensured that you'll be removed from royal properties and royal protection effective immediately," William explained calmly. "The van will take you to a private residence where you'll remain while arrangements are made for your permanent relocation. Your belongings will be packed and sent to you within 48 hours. Andrew backed away from the window, as if the vehicles outside were military tanks preparing for assault. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating the bubble of denial and entitlement that had protected him for so long. He wasn't just facing another scandal that could be managed with public relations and legal maneuvering. He was facing complete exile from the only life he had ever known. "You can't do this," Andrew repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. "I have rights. I have legal protections. I can fight this through the courts, through Parliament, through whom?" William asked quietly. "Who exactly do you think will stand up for you now? Which politicians want to be associated with defending your behavior? Which lawyers want to build their reputation on your case? Which members of this family are willing to risk their own standing to protect someone who has repeatedly proven that he puts his own desires above everything and everyone else?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one stripping away another layer of Andrew's delusions about his own importance and protection. He had always believed that his birth into the royal family gave him a kind of permanent immunity, that being the Queen's son and the King's brother made him untouchable no matter what he did. That belief was dying a very public death in his own sitting room. A knock at the front door interrupted the confrontation. William could hear quiet voices as Andrew's remaining security staff dealt with the arrival of the removal team. The sound of official business being conducted in his own home seemed to break something inside Andrew. He slumped back into his chair, looking older and more defeated than William had ever seen him. "How long have you been planning this?" Andrew asked, his voice hollow. "Since the moment I realized you hadn't learned anything from what happened before," William replied honestly. "Since I understood that giving you chances and second opportunities wasn't kindness, it was enabling behavior that hurt innocent people. Every month you remained protected by this family's name was another month you used that protection to cause more damage." The sitting room door opened, and a man in a dark suit entered with respectful deference. William recognized him as Commander James Mitchell, a former Royal Protection Officer who now worked in private security for discretionary situations requiring absolute confidentiality. Mitchell's presence meant that everything William had arranged was proceeding exactly as planned. "Your Royal Highness," Mitchell addressed William with a slight bow. "We're ready to proceed whenever you give the authorization." William looked at his uncle one last time, searching for any sign of remorse, any indication that Andrew understood the gravity of what his behavior had cost, not just himself, but everyone who had ever tried to protect him. Instead, he saw only self-pity and resentment, the entitled fury of someone who believed the world owed him forgiveness regardless of how often he betrayed that trust. 5 minutes, William told Mitchell. "Give us 5 more minutes." When they were alone again, William sat down across from Andrew for the first time since entering the house. The gesture was deliberate. He wanted to be at eye level for what might be their final conversation as members of the same family. "I need you to understand something," William said quietly. "This isn't revenge. It's not anger or family politics or a power struggle. This is about protecting people who can't protect themselves. From someone who has proven, repeatedly, that he won't control his own behavior. You've had every advantage, every protection, every opportunity to make better choices, and you've squandered all of it."
Andrew's response surprised him with its honesty.
"Do you think I don't know that?" he whispered. "Do you think I don't understand what I've lost, what I've thrown away? Do you think any of this has been easy for me?" For the first time in the conversation, William saw something that might have been genuine remorse in his uncle's eyes. But it was too little, too late, and tinged with too much self-pity to change anything about the situation they both found themselves in. "What you've lost isn't the point anymore," William replied. "What matters now is preventing you from causing more damage. What matters is showing the people of this country that being born into this family doesn't put you above consequences forever." The 5 minutes were ending, and William could hear movement in the hallway as Mitchell's team prepared to complete their task. The surreal nature of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. 2 members of the British royal family, sitting in a room filled with evidence of inexcusable behavior, discussing the forced exile of a prince as if it were a routine administrative matter. "Will I ever see the family again?" Andrew asked, and for the first time he sounded like a frightened old man rather than an entitled prince. William's answer was honest and brutal. "That depends entirely on you. If you accept this exile gracefully, if you disappear from public life completely, if you never again put yourself in a position where your behavior can reflect on this family, then perhaps someday, in very private circumstances, that might be possible. But if you fight this, if you make this public, if you try to use your position or your connections to avoid the consequences of your actions, then no. You'll never see any of us again." Commander Mitchell appeared in the doorway again, his expression politely neutral but his meaning clear. The time for conversation had ended. The time for action had arrived. William stood, straightening his coat and preparing to witness something that no heir to the British throne had ever been required to oversee. The forced removal of a family member for behavior incompatible with royal duties and family honor. As they prepared to leave the sitting room, Andrew grabbed William's arm with desperate strength. "Please," he whispered, "don't let this be how my story ends. Don't let this be how people remember Prince Andrew." William looked down at his uncle's hand, then met his eyes with a gaze that was both compassionate and implacable. "Your story doesn't end here," he said quietly. "How it ends depends entirely on what you choose to do with whatever time you have left. But your story, as a member of this family, that ends today." The walk from the sitting room to the front entrance of Royal Lodge felt longer than any journey William had ever taken. Each step echoed through hallways lined with portraits of deceased monarchs, their painted eyes seeming to watch this unprecedented moment in royal history. Andrew moved beside him like a man walking to his own execution, his earlier defiance replaced by a resigned acceptance that was somehow more heartbreaking than his anger had been. Commander Mitchell's team had arranged themselves with military precision throughout the house. They moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals who understood that discretion was paramount, that what happened here today could never become tabloid fodder or palace gossip. These were men and women who had devoted their careers to protecting the royal family, and now they were protecting it from one of its own members. As they reached the entrance hall, William noticed that Andrew's personal belongings had already been discreetly packed into several leather cases. The speed and thoroughness of the operation impressed him. Clearly, Mitchell's team had been planning for this possibility longer than William had realized. Every personal item, every photograph, every trace of Andrew's life at Royal Lodge had been carefully catalogued and prepared for removal. "My things," Andrew said weakly, staring at the cases as if seeing his entire life reduced to luggage. "Everything will be returned to you intact," Mitchell assured him professionally. "We've been very careful to ensure that nothing personal has been damaged or lost. Your new residence has been prepared with all necessary furnishings, and these items will be delivered within 24 hours." The black van waited in the circular driveway like a hearse, its engine running quietly in the cold morning air. William could see his uncle's remaining security details standing at a respectful distance, their faces carefully neutral as they witnessed the end of their assignment. These were men who had protected Andrew for years, who had accompanied him to public events and private meetings, who had become part of his daily routine. Now they were watching him be removed from their protection forever. "The transport will take you directly to your new location," Mitchell explained to Andrew with quiet professionalism. "The journey will take approximately 2 hours. You'll be accompanied by 2 officers who will ensure your safety and comfort during the transition. Upon arrival, you'll be briefed on the arrangements that have been made for your accommodation and security." Andrew nodded mechanically, but William could see that he was barely processing the information. The reality of what was happening seemed to be overwhelming his ability to think clearly. This was no longer the confident prince who had faced down hostile interviews and parliamentary inquiries. This was a broken man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Before you go," William said quietly, "I need your word on something." Andrew looked at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope and desperation, as if William might still offer him some escape from this situation. "I need your promise that you won't contact any members of the press, any publishers, any agents, or anyone else who might be interested in your version of events," William continued. "I need your word that you'll disappear completely from public life and never attempt to profit from your position or your knowledge of family business." The request was reasonable, but devastating in its implications. Andrew was being asked to give up not just his current life, but any possibility of future relevance or income based on his royal connections. He was being asked to become a non-person, someone who had never existed in the public consciousness. "And if I refuse?" Andrew asked, though they both knew he had no real choice in the matter. "Then the alternative arrangements we've prepared will be much less comfortable," William replied evenly. "The choice is yours, but it's also final. Whatever you decide in the next 60 seconds will determine how the rest of your life unfolds." Andrew looked around Royal Lodge one last time, his gaze taking in the familiar surroundings that had been his refuge for so many years. The pink walls, the carefully maintained gardens, the sense of security and permanence that came with living in a royal residence, all of it was disappearing forever, replaced by an uncertain future in a location he hadn't chosen with protections he couldn't guarantee. "You have my word," Andrew said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. William nodded to Mitchell, who stepped forward with a document folder. "These are the terms of your relocation and the conditions of your ongoing support," Mitchell explained. "Please sign where indicated to confirm your understanding and agreement." As Andrew signed the papers with a hand that shook visibly, William felt a complex mixture of emotions that he hadn't expected. There was satisfaction at seeing justice finally served, relief that the family would be protected from further scandal, but also a profound sadness at what it had cost to reach this point. Whatever Andrew's faults, he was still family, and watching a family member be exiled felt like watching a part of their shared history die. The signing completed, Mitchell nodded to his team. 2 officers approached Andrew with respectful deference, positioning themselves to escort him to the waiting van. These weren't guards or jailers. They were professionals ensuring that the transition proceeded smoothly and safely. But their presence made the reality of Andrew's situation undeniable. He was no longer a free man making his own choices about where to go and what to do. "William," Andrew said suddenly, turning to face his nephew one last time, "I want you to know that I understand why you're doing this. I don't agree with it, and I don't think it's fair, but I understand it. You're protecting something bigger than both of us." The unexpected acknowledgement caught William off guard. Throughout their confrontation, he had been prepared for anger, denial, bargaining, even threats. He hadn't expected this moment of clarity from someone who had spent years avoiding responsibility for his own actions. "I wish it had never come to this," William replied honestly. "I wish you had made different choices, learned from your mistakes, put the family's reputation above your own desires. But we are where we are, and there's no going back." Andrew nodded slowly, then did something that surprised everyone present. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his head, and walked toward the van with dignity intact. Whatever else could be said about Prince Andrew, he was still a member of the royal family, and he would leave Royal Lodge like one. The officers fell into step beside him, their movements respectful rather than forceful. As the van door closed behind Andrew, William realized that he was watching the end of an era, not just for his uncle, but for the entire concept of royal immunity from consequences. The idea that being born into the royal family provided permanent protection from the results of poor judgment and criminal behavior was dying in that driveway, replaced by a new understanding that even princes could be held accountable for their actions. The van pulled away slowly, its tinted windows preventing any final glimpse of Andrew as he began his journey into exile. William watched until it disappeared beyond the gates of Windsor Great Park, then turned to Commander Mitchell with questions about the arrangements that had been made. "The location is secure and completely private," Mitchell assured him. "It's comfortable but isolated, with appropriate security measures and communication restrictions. He'll be well cared for, but he won't be able to leave without authorization or contact anyone without supervision. Think of it as a very comfortable form of house arrest." William nodded, satisfied that the arrangements balanced Andrew's safety with the family's need for security. The last thing anyone wanted was for Andrew to disappear completely and then resurface years later with a tell-all book or documentary that could damage the monarchy even further. As Mitchell's team completed their work and departed, William found himself alone at Royal Lodge for the first time in his memory. The house felt different now, not just empty, but somehow cleansed of the tension and scandal that had surrounded Andrew's presence. It would need to be thoroughly prepared before any other member of the family could consider living there. But that was a problem for another day. William's phone buzzed with a secure message from his father. "Is it done?" The simple question carried enormous weight. Charles wasn't just asking whether Andrew had been removed. He was asking whether the decision they had made together would protect the monarchy from further damage, whether the cost of exile would be worth the peace it might bring. "Yes," William typed back. "It's done." The response came immediately. "Come home. We need to discuss what happens next." What happens next? The phrase echoed in William's mind as he prepared to leave Royal Lodge. The immediate crisis had been addressed, but the long-term implications were just beginning to unfold. How would they explain Andrew's sudden disappearance from public life? How would they handle questions from other family members who hadn't been informed of the decision? How would they manage the media speculation that was bound to arise when people noticed that Prince Andrew was no longer appearing at any royal events? More importantly, how would this decision change the monarchy itself? William had just established a precedent that even blood relatives could be removed from the family if their behavior became incompatible with royal duties. It was a necessary precedent, but also a dangerous one. Future generations would remember that Prince William had exiled his own uncle, and they would either praise him for his courage or condemn him for his ruthlessness. As his convoy pulled away from Royal Lodge, William caught sight of the house in his rearview mirror. It looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, its pink walls and manicured gardens giving no hint of the drama that had unfolded there. In a few hours, the only evidence of Andrew's forced departure would be the absence of his personal belongings, and the silence that comes when someone who has been a constant presence suddenly disappears. William's phone rang, displaying Catherine's number. He answered immediately, needing to hear his wife's voice after one of the most difficult mornings of his life. "How are you?" she asked without preamble, her concern evident even through the encrypted connection. "It's done," William said, echoing his message to his father. "Andrew is gone. The family is safe." "And how are you?" Catherine repeated, making it clear that she wasn't asking about the operation's success, but about her husband's emotional state. William considered the question carefully as his convoy made its way back toward London. How was he? He felt exhausted, relieved, guilty, proud, and terrified all at the same time. He had just made one of the most difficult decisions any future king had ever been forced to make, and he wouldn't know whether it was the right choice for years to come. "I'm learning what it means to be king," William said finally. I'm learning that sometimes protecting the crown means making choices that cost you personally. I'm learning that duty isn't always noble or inspiring. Sometimes it's just doing what needs to be done, regardless of how much you hate doing it. Catherine's response was immediate and firm. You did the right thing. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, you protected innocent people from someone who had proven he wouldn't protect them himself. History will remember you for having the courage to hold even family members accountable. As William ended the call and continued his journey back to London, he reflected on his wife's words. History would indeed remember this day, but how it would judge his actions remained to be seen. What mattered now was ensuring that Andrew's exile served its purpose, protecting the monarchy from further scandal while sending a clear message that being born into the royal family was a privilege that could be revoked if it was repeatedly abused. The black van carrying Andrew had disappeared into the anonymity of British countryside roads, taking with it not just a disgraced prince, but an entire era of royal immunity from consequences. What emerged from this day would be a new understanding of what it meant to serve the crown, and what happened to those who chose to serve only themselves. 6 months had passed since the morning that changed everything, and Buckingham Palace had settled into a new rhythm that nobody discussed but everyone understood. Prince Andrew's name had gradually disappeared from court circular listings, his photograph had been quietly removed from official displays, and his absence from family gatherings had become so normalized that newer staff members might have wondered if he had ever existed at all. William stood in his private office at Kensington Palace, reading the daily briefing that had once included updates about Andrew's activities and whereabouts. Now there was simply a single line. The Duke of York remains in secure accommodation, with no incidents to report. The simplicity of that statement belied the complex emotions that William still carried about his decision to exile his uncle. The knock on his door was soft but insistent. Catherine entered, carrying a tea service and wearing the expression she reserved for conversations about family matters that couldn't be overheard by staff or security. She had become William's closest confidant in managing the psychological aftermath of Andrew's removal, helping him process the guilt, relief, and uncertainty that came with making such an unprecedented decision. "The children are asking again," Catherine said quietly, settling into the chair across from William's desk. "Charlotte specifically wants to know why Uncle Andrew didn't come to George's birthday party. She remembers him from Christmas 2 years ago." This was the conversation William had been dreading since that December morning. How do you explain to young children that their great-uncle had been removed from the family for behavior they couldn't understand? How do you maintain the innocence of childhood while preparing them for the realities of their own future responsibilities as members of the royal family? "What did you tell her?" William asked, though he suspected he knew Catherine's approach would be both honest and age-appropriate. "I told her that Uncle Andrew had made some choices that meant he needed to live somewhere else for a while, and that sometimes adults have to face consequences for their actions, even when they're part of our family," Catherine replied. She seemed to accept that, but George is starting to ask more detailed questions. He's old enough to notice patterns and absences. William nodded, understanding that his children would eventually need to know the full truth about what had happened to their great-uncle, and why their father had been forced to make such a difficult decision. That conversation would come sooner than he hoped, but later than it probably should. The balance between protecting their childhood and preparing them for their royal destiny was becoming more delicate with each passing month. His secure phone buzzed with a message from Commander Mitchell. "Monthly report ready for your review. No incidents. Subject remains compliant with all terms of arrangement." The clinical language couldn't mask the human reality behind those words. Andrew was apparently adapting to his exile with surprising grace, accepting the restrictions of his new life without the protests or escape attempts that everyone had feared. According to Mitchell's reports, he spent his days reading, writing, in what appeared to be a private journal, and maintaining a small garden on the grounds of his secure residence. It was a quiet, almost monastic existence that bore no resemblance to the entitled social lifestyle he had lived as a working royal. "Have you heard from your father today?" Catherine asked, noticing William's distraction. King Charles had struggled more than anyone with Andrew's exile. As monarch, he understood the necessity of the decision, but as an older brother, he carried guilt about abandoning a sibling who had already been damaged by years of scandal and public humiliation. The king's cancer treatment had been successful, but the stress of family division had taken its own toll on his health and spirits.
"He's considering a private visit," William said carefully.
"Not to Royal Lodge or anywhere public, but to the secure location. Mitchell thinks it could be arranged safely, and father believes it might provide some plume rob change, closure for both of them." Catherine's expression showed her immediate concern. "Is that wise?" What if Andrew sees it as an opportunity to negotiate his return? What if he tries to manipulate your father's guilt to change his situation? These were exactly the questions that had been keeping William awake at night. Charles' desire to see his brother was understandable, even admirable in its way, but it also risked undoing 6 months of careful separation and sending mixed messages about the permanence of Andrew's exile. The decision to remove Andrew had been presented as final and irreversible. Any family contact that suggested otherwise could undermine the entire arrangement. I've told Father that any visit would need to be brief, supervised, and conditional on Andrew's continued compliance with his exile terms, William said. If he shows any sign of trying to negotiate his return or manipulate the situation, the visit ends immediately and no future contact will be permitted. The conversation was interrupted by William's private secretary announcing an unexpected visitor. Princess Anne had arrived at Kensington Palace requesting an immediate meeting with William, and her tone suggested this wasn't a social call. Anne had been notably absent from discussions about Andrew's exile, neither supporting nor opposing the decision, but maintaining a strategic silence that left everyone uncertain about her true feelings. Anne entered William's office with the brisk efficiency that had defined her entire royal career. At 73, she remained one of the hardest-working members of the royal family, someone who had never been touched by scandal and who viewed royal duty as a privilege that came with non-negotiable responsibilities. Her presence in William's office suggested that Andrew's situation had finally motivated her to break her silence. "We need to discuss Andrew," Anne said without preamble, settling into the chair that Catherine had vacated. "Not his exile, which I believe was necessary and long overdue, but what happens next? How long do we maintain this arrangement? What are the long-term implications? And most importantly, what precedent are we setting for future generations of royals who might face similar situations?" The questions were characteristically direct and practical. Anne had always been the family member who focused on solutions rather than emotions, who approached royal crises as management problems that required strategic thinking rather than sentimental responses. Her support for Andrew's exile was reassuring, but her concerns about its implementation were troubling. "The arrangement continues indefinitely," William replied. Andrew agreed to permanent exile, in exchange for comfortable accommodation and basic security. There's no timeline for review or reconsideration because there's no scenario under which his return would be appropriate. Anne's expression suggested she had expected this answer, but wasn't entirely satisfied with it. "That's the official position, certainly, but we both know that indefinite and permanent are different concepts when dealing with family members. Andrew is 63 years old. If he lives another 20 years in exile, are we prepared to maintain this arrangement for 2 decades? What happens when Charles is no longer king and these decisions become your responsibility entirely?" The questions forced William to confront aspects of Andrew's exile that he had been avoiding. The immediate crisis had been managed successfully, but the long-term implications were more complex than he had initially considered. Maintaining Andrew in comfortable exile required ongoing resources, security arrangements, and psychological management that would need to continue for potentially decades. More importantly, Anne continued, "What message does this send to George, Charlotte, and Louis about what happens when royals fail to meet their obligations? Are we teaching them that family members who disappoint the crown simply disappear, or are we showing them that accountability and rehabilitation are possible even after serious mistakes?" This was the question that cut to the heart of William's deepest concerns about his decision. He had acted to protect the monarchy from Andrew's continued scandals, but he hadn't fully considered what lessons his children would learn from watching their great-uncle vanish from family life. Would they understand that actions have consequences, or would they fear that any mistake could result in their own exile from the only family they had ever known? "Andrew wasn't just disappointing the crown," William said defensively. "He was actively harming people and using his royal position to avoid accountability. The situations aren't comparable." "I'm not questioning your decision," Anne replied firmly. "I'm questioning whether we've thought through all the implications of how we implemented it. Andrew needed to be removed from public life. That was clear to everyone who understood the evidence. But complete exile from family contact? Permanent separation with no possibility of private rehabilitation or redemption? That's unprecedented, and it sets a standard that future generations will have to live with." William realized that Anne was raising questions he should have considered more carefully 6 months earlier. In his determination to protect the monarchy from further scandal, he had chosen the most extreme solution available. But extreme solutions, even necessary ones, created their own problems over time. His phone rang with a call from Commander Mitchell, and William's expression grew serious as he listened to the briefing. Andrew had been found unconscious in his residence that morning, apparently having suffered a minor heart attack during the night. He was stable and receiving excellent medical care, but the incident had raised questions about the long-term sustainability of his exile arrangements. "He's asking to see family," William told Anne after ending the call. "The doctors think the heart attack might have been triggered by depression and isolation. They're recommending that some level of family contact might be beneficial for his psychological and physical health." Anne's expression didn't change, but William could see her mind working through the implications. A sick, isolated Andrew was potentially more dangerous to the monarchy than the scandalous but connected Andrew they had exiled. If he died alone and forgotten, it would create a different kind of crisis. Questions about royal mercy, family loyalty, and whether the punishment had exceeded the crime. "What are you thinking?" Anne asked. William was quiet for several long minutes, understanding that whatever decision he made now would reshape Andrew's exile in ways that could affect the entire arrangement. Complete isolation wasn't sustainable if it was literally killing him, but any family contact risks sending mixed messages about the permanence of his removal from royal life. "Supervised visits," William said finally, "brief, infrequent, and conditional on his continued compliance with exile terms. Father can see him privately, perhaps once or twice a year, to provide human connection without suggesting that his return is possible. The visits stop immediately if Andrew tries to negotiate his situation, or if his health improves to the point where isolation is no longer medically dangerous." It wasn't the perfect solution, but it balanced the monarchy's need for protection with basic human compassion. Andrew would remain in exile, but he wouldn't die alone and forgotten like a character from a medieval tragedy. The arrangement would be managed carefully to prevent any misunderstanding about his status or his future. Anne nodded slowly. "That seems reasonable. But William, I want you to promise me something. When you become king, when these decisions are entirely yours to make, remember that mercy and justice aren't always opposites. Sometimes the most effective way to protect an institution is to show that it's capable of both accountability and compassion." As Anne prepared to leave, she paused at the door with one final observation. "Your children will remember how you handled this situation for the rest of their lives. Make sure they remember it as an example of difficult but necessary leadership, not as a lesson in how family members who disappoint you simply disappear forever." After Anne left, William sat alone in his office as evening shadows lengthened across London. The weight of his decision about Andrew felt different now, not lighter or heavier, but more complex, with implications that would continue unfolding for years or even decades to come. He had protected the monarchy from immediate scandal, but he had also created a new model for how royal accountability would work in the modern era. His reflection was interrupted by the sound of his children returning from their afternoon activities. George's voice echoed through the corridors as he excitedly described his rugby practice. Charlotte's laughter filled the entrance hall, and Louise's questions about everything he encountered reminded William why he had made such difficult decisions in the first place. These children would inherit a monarchy that had been shaped by the choices he was making today, and they would judge those choices based on the kind of institution they received. Catherine appeared in his doorway with a knowing smile. "Dinner in 20 minutes, she said. "The children want to tell you about their day, and George has questions about the state visit next month." Normal, wonderful, complicated family life. As William prepared to join his family for dinner, he realized that Andrew's exile had taught him something unexpected about being king. The crown wasn't just about making difficult decisions or protecting institutions. It was about creating the kind of monarchy that future generations could serve with pride. Sometimes that required harsh justice. Sometimes it demanded unexpected mercy. But always, it needed leaders who understood the difference between protecting their position and serving something greater than themselves. The black van that had taken Andrew away 6 months earlier had carried more than just a disgraced prince into exile. It had carried away an old understanding of royal immunity and family loyalty, replacing it with new concepts of accountability and consequence that would define the monarchy for generations to come. Whether that transformation would strengthen or weaken the crown remained to be seen, but William was finally at peace with the knowledge that he had chosen evolution over preservation, justice over comfort, and the future over the past. In a secure residence 2 hours from London, Prince Andrew was recovering from his heart attack while reading reports about his nephew's growing reputation as a strong future king. According to Commander Mitchell's latest briefing, Andrew had expressed no anger or resentment about his situation, only a quiet sadness about the family connections he had lost through his own choices. He was, by all accounts, finally learning the lessons that should have shaped his behavior decades earlier. The exile would continue, the family would adapt, and the monarchy would survive this crisis as it had survived so many others. But it would be a different institution when the dust settled. More accountable, more aware of its responsibilities, and more willing to hold even its most privileged members to the standards they claimed to represent. History would remember Prince William's decision to exile his uncle as either an act of necessary courage or cold-blooded ruthlessness. But William no longer cared about history's judgment. He cared about raising children who understood that power was responsibility, that privilege was temporary, and that sometimes the hardest decisions were also the most important ones. Everything else would take care of itself.